Okay, welcome back. I'm calling this one A Change in America, but first we're going to talk about how the world is changing as well, and then we'll get into more specifics about America. So, the big thing that's going on here in the 1800s is the agricultural slash industrial revolution. And it starts with the agricultural revolution, which kind of leads to the industrial revolution, and then they're both intertwined together. Okay, but the agricultural revolution, right? Agriculture refers to food production, and so that means we're going to get a lot more food, and a lot more food is going to lead to these things: more time, more goods or more stuff, more things that are being made, and it's going to lead to education, right? Something that you are taking advantage of right now. Okay, so let's look at the causes of the agricultural revolution. Um, Basically, we got two different things going on. One is new breeding techniques. Okay, so if you're thinking about agriculture in terms of animals, we see that we're making new breeds of animals, and those animals are going to basically be bigger or better for what we're trying to use them for. Right, so um, for example, I believe it started with a guy in England breeding sheep, and basically he got sheep that were just always large. They had way more meat on them, and so because of that, um, he could have the same amount of land, and he could feed them the same amount, and yet they were bigger. They weren't wasting as much energy on other things, and they were putting more of that food energy into meat production. And so you now had more meat for the same amount of effort. And we can imagine that being applied to all sorts of different agricultural animals as well as to different plants. And so we get hybrids of different plants that are going to either be more resistant to diseases or produce bigger fruit or whatever it is. Okay. Coupled with that is inventions, right? We get new technology that's going to allow us to do farming easier. We're going to get more stuff for less effort. And so a couple examples of that would be the seed drill, which made planting easier, and the cotton gin, which made it easier to separate the seed from the cotton. Okay. So what does this agricultural revolution lead to? Well, as we talked about at the very top here, it leads to more time, more goods, and more education. But ultimately, it's going to lead to a higher population, right? If there is more food, then there can be more people. And a higher population means more workers. And if you have more workers, you can do more things. You have more labor, to use a technical term. You have more labor in which to do things or build things. Okay, and so here is another sort of technical definition here. But if you have labor, right, which is workers, and you have resources like rivers and coal and iron here, and then you have money to invest, or capital if we're going to sound fancy here, then you have all of the factors of production that allow you to start to make more stuff. You got to have money, you got to have to build, let's say, the factory, you got to have labor to work in the factory, and you got to have resources. But if you have all those things, now you have the factors of production, and that is going to lead to this just exponential growth, this super large growth in the amount of stuff that is being produced in the 1800s versus earlier in the history of the world. Okay? An abundance of all three leads to what we call the Industrial Revolution. We're going to see way more stuff being made. Okay? So the Industrial Revolution first happens in Britain, which had all the factors of production. And that's partially because it's an empire. Now, Britain itself, they found some coal and they have rivers and stuff like that. But Britain had this huge empire all over the world, and so they were able to um, use the fact that they had tons of people in their empire as labor, tons of resources, um, and the fact that Britain had gotten very rich off the colonies to sort of begin this industrial revolution, which quickly spreads everywhere. If you remember, the rest of Europe was busy fighting Napoleon. Britain was also fighting Napoleon, but Britain's on an island, and so it wasn't damaged by the wars, even though it fought in them and lost people in them. And remember, the Napoleonic Wars is one of the reasons the U.S. fought the War of 1812, because they're like, hey, if Britain is busy fighting Napoleon, then we can go off and get Canada or whatever. But Britain survives unscathed because they're on an island, and they have a huge empire. And so the Industrial Revolution is going to start there, but quickly it's going to spread other places, including America. In fact, Americans would sometimes steal factory plans and machine plans out of England, bring them back to the U.S., and reconstruct those machines in America. That intellectual property theft is something that still happens today, although it looks a little different. It's like computer hackers breaking into companies and stealing blueprints and stuff like that. Okay? All right, so this is the big circle of industrialization, which in its simplest form describes what's happening in the 1800s and continues to happen today. Okay, with the Industrial Revolution, you had more stuff being made, and people had more stuff than ever before, and that stuff usually existed to make them more efficient, right? If you normally had to plant all your seeds, but now there's a machine that can plant your seeds, you're going to be more efficient, right? And we can apply that to everything. If there is now a machine that makes it a little bit easier to do any household task, and now you're going to have more time. And so more inventions are going to lead to more time and money for people in general, as a general rule, for humanity, which is going to lead to more inventions, because if you now have more time and more money, then you're going to be trying to make more things, and those things make you more efficient, which gives you more time and money, which gives you more inventions, which gives you more time and money, and the cycle repeats. Okay, and so now one person, can sit at my computer and talk into this microphone, and I can, if people were willing, reach anyone in the world, right? That is a power that people probably would have wished they could have had, but they couldn't have. But now, due to so many cycles of this more time, more money, more time, more money, we have invented so much stuff that I can sit at a computer and reach anyone in the world that I want to. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution is changing everywhere around the world, including in America. So let's look at how it's affecting America and some of the other stuff that's going on in America. Okay, so one of the first big things is that the Industrial Revolution affects the textile industry. So we're talking cloth, clothes, blankets, sheets, linens, all of those things. Okay, we had a couple inventions that are going to influence that. One is the cotton gin, which let you separate the seeds from the cotton, invented by Eli Whitney. And the other is the power loom, which was basically a machine that could weave clothes. So you didn't have to weave them by hand. Now a machine could weave cloth and fabric. Okay, and that is going to change everything. So where does all this cotton come from? Well, there are different places in the world where cotton production came from, but one of the main areas was the American South, right, is where most of this cotton came from. And so America is going to play an important role in this Industrial Revolution because of all that cotton in the South. And the amount of cotton produced in the South, because of inventions like the cotton gin, just skyrockets. Okay, so you can see here in 1800 there was 15,000 tons of cotton processed, and by 1900, my computer is cutting it off. I can't see the number, but I know that it is about 50 times. I think it was actually 53 times more cotton. There we go, 790 tons, 790,000 tons. So more than 50-fold increase in the amount of cotton production. Okay, so what that means is that if you're living in the early 1800s, right, maybe you have a couple pieces of clothes, maybe you have a Sunday dress and you have a everyday dress, and then by the time you get to the 1900s, now we can see that there's going to be way more fabrics. People could wear multiple clothes. I mean, nowadays, you might not even know how many t-shirts you own, right? And this is a very different experience from people for most of humanity, but this Industrial Revolution is going to change that. And it's going to, in fact, affect America, right? Which we'll talk about a little more, but basically, the American South, we're going to see that cotton is super important. And what it actually does is, even though it makes it more efficient, you need less people to get more cotton. This actually makes the American South rely on slavery even more, because it's become such a cash cow to produce cotton that the American South is going to need laborers to work all these machines and get the cotton out of the fields. Okay, so this doesn't just affect the textile industry, it affects all sorts of things. Okay, we see the telegraph gets invented, which was before the telephone, a way to send messages across land and ultimately across bodies of water as well. Basically, like a telephone, there was a line, and information could be sent across that line at the time. It wasn't advanced enough that you could just process a human voice instantly, but you could send a series of, let's say, taps, long taps and slow taps, Morse code, and communicate that way, and send messages. So instead of messages taking weeks to reach a place by mail, right now a telegraph could send that near instantaneous. Okay, so that's going to be a big transformation. Transportation is going to increase a ton. So we get the invention of railroads, people laying railroad lines, which is going to allow people and materials to travel far distances for far cheaper. We saw earlier in the video, in the earlier video, that the Erie Canal, but other canals are built that are going to allow for the transportation of goods. Steamboats means that now you can travel both ways up a river easily, not just in the direction that the river is flowing easily, but now you can, without needing to use wind or human labor, a steamboat can go upriver, which is going to, again, just make everything easy for transportation, better roads, etc. Okay, so if you look at travel time from New York City to a few of these cities, okay, it's going to decrease a ton. Okay, so you can see Pittsburgh took 2 weeks to get to. 30 years later, it only takes a week. Detroit took 4 weeks to get to from New York. 30 years later, it only takes 2 weeks. And then St. Louis here, I don't know, I have this little typo here, but from 2 weeks down to half a week. Okay, so travel time is going to decrease, and that's only going to keep decreasing, right? As railroads get built, these numbers will drop even more, and continue to drop with new inventions, right? Cars and then airplanes, etc. Okay, so to highlight just how drastic a change this is, I have a couple graphs here. And basically what happens with the Industrial Revolution is that with all of these new inventions and new agricultural techniques in farming, new ways to farm, you need less people to produce the same amount of food. And that's going to cause this complete huge shift in where people live in America. So you can see here that in 1840, right, almost 70% of all Americans live on a farm. And that means that because they all live on a farm, everyone is kind of spread out on their own little farms. And it also means that for the most part, the children are working on the farm, right? Because all the hands were needed to work the farm, as many laborers as possible. But with these new inventions, we see that a complete decrease over time. So from 1840 till we get to like 1900, it's gone from 70% living on farms to 40% living on farms. And today, it's only a few percent of people that are living on farms, and yet they're producing more food than ever before, right? Um, you needed 70% of the population doing food to feed everyone in 1840. Now you only need 3-4% of the population doing food to feed everyone. So what that means is instead of in 1840, 30% of people being able to do all of the other things, whether it's make things, invent things, work in a factory, build things, construct things, be in the government, be a religious leader. And only 30% of the population could do that because the other 70% had to produce enough food for everyone. Now, 97% of people can do all the other things and not have to worry about food production. Okay, so this is a huge shift. You think about this number just going down, but if we extended this number backwards for thousands of years, it's going to be up here, right? So for thousands of years, it's a high number, and then all of a sudden, in a very short amount of time, it completely goes down. And that's going to change America. And if we look at another graph that just shows rural population, so those living in the country, which most of those are going to be on farms, but not everyone. You can see that in 1830, 90% of people lived outside of cities. And that number also is just going to completely tank, right? And so now only about 25%, 20% of people are living outside of cities. So this is going to be the big shift. Cities in the 1800s are going to boom in size. People are going to move from the country to the city because they no longer need to be a part of food production. And now that the Industrial Revolution is building factories and all sorts of services, people will live in cities. And so we just see people fleeing the country and moving to the cities, so to speak. And so the city populations go up, the rural populations either go down or stay the same because the cities are just growing a lot faster. Because people are still having kids in the country, but then some of them might move into the city, and so we see that what's happening is that the city population is just skyrocketing. So people are now living in cities. Less people are working on farms. There's all of a sudden more time, so to speak, for people to do other things. I'm not saying people all of a sudden have a bunch of free time, because your average laborer might go from spending 12 hours working on the farm to 12 hours working in a factory, and their life might actually be worse. They might actually have worse living conditions. But if we look at humanity as a whole, all of a sudden there's a lot more time. Okay? So during this time, we're just going to talk about a few things that are going on. So one is what we call the Second Great Awakening. So we mentioned the Great Awakening briefly. This was a period of religious fervor and renewal where people would go around preaching and hosting revivals where someone would come into town, set up a tent, or set up a place in a public meeting space, and people would come and hear them preach. And when there isn't a whole lot to do in town at this time, right, a lot of people would come out and they would have this conversion to deeper religious life and experience. And in the Second Great Awakening, we see a similar thing happen. Revivals going around, preachers traveling from town to town. And one of the big guys to start this was Charles Finney. And he was a Presbyterian leader, and he went around to a few revivals, and he also was a prominent abolitionist, and he also was a big fan of gender rights as well. And so at his church services, you had women sometimes do the preaching or the praying, and you had crowds that were mixed races. And so he was, at the time, very interesting and influential on what was going on. Okay. Now, the Second Great Awakening, if we're trying to look at it not just from like a religious perspective, but from some sort of anthropological or cultural perspective, which just mean we're looking at what's happening to the people at the time. It ties into a bunch of other movements. I don't want to confuse you with a bunch of fancy words. Okay, so at this time, there's a lot of movements going on. People are emphasizing the individual. So now we can tie that to the Great Awakening and say people are looking for that personal relationship with Jesus. And so as the culture is emphasizing individualism, we kind of see it reflected as well in the religious movement as well. Okay, we see that democracy is increasing. More people are getting the right to vote. More people are having the ability to participate in government. And so people want to have a say. And all of these things kind of tie together. Then there's two sort of big movements going on in the artistical and literary world, which is Romanticism and Realism. I think I'm going to have you guys just look into that a little bit. We also see eventually in the 1800s, we get the AME Church, which is the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is basically a black church. And so this religious experience is being shared across the races, and the black community is also building its own churches, its own church leaders, etc. Okay, we see a short-lived movement called the Shakers, which comes out of this time period, which was a movement based on great religious fervor, but they also didn't believe in reproduction, and so it was a pretty short-lived movement because it only grew with converts. So that was kind of a problem. All right, we're going to see another movement come out of all these isms. There's a lot of isms in the 1800s. So we have Romanticism, Realism, and we get this movement called Transcendentalism, which was a movement emphasizing things such as living simply, self-reliant, free, optimistic, individual, inspired by nature. And so you can kind of see this Transcendentalism as like a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. Everyone's moving into the cities and working in these dirty factories, right? And the Transcendentals are like, let's just go sit in the woods and read a nice book, and get back, in connection with nature and feel good about things. And so, oftentimes movements happen in reaction to other things, right? It's like someone today saying, like, let's just, set the phone down and let's go outside, right? Get off your phone and just go breathe the fresh air, right? It's kind of a similar idea. But I put a small critique here of the Transcendentals because they were often like, kind of on the wealthier side, so they could afford to live a life where they went in the woods and read a book, and they didn't really want to work and kind of stuff like that. Okay. Another big movement at this time was prison reform. We see that prison, primarily before this time, was punishment, and there's this big push for it to be based on rehabilitation. I cannot speak today. Okay, I'm not even going to try. Rehabbing the prisoners, trying to teach them, educate them, instruct them, get them ready for life, renew them, convert them to a deeper religious experience, whatever it was, to rehab them so that they were ready to participate in society. And so we see this conflict exist to this day between, is prison supposed to be about punishment, or is it supposed to be about rehab so that they can participate in society again? But before this time period, it was basically just punishment. Okay. Then the other big movement that comes is schools. I say this because, right, in the whole history of humanity, you happen to be born after the 1800s, right? Which means school is just this annoying thing you have to do. But if you remember from that graph, before this time, unless you happen to be born into a wealthy family, which was a very small percentage of the population, you were probably going to just spend your childhood working on the farm, right? But now that less people are needed to produce the same amount of food because of machines, now schools start to open so that children can instead get an education so that they can do something else besides help out on the farm. Okay, so uh, you can see in 1834, Pennsylvania becomes the first state with a tax-supported public school system, and it's just going to spread quickly. By 1860, all states have some form of public elementary school that is going to be provided by the state. Okay, so in this very short amount of time, and this is because of that agricultural industrial revolution, now children don't have to work to produce the same amount of food, and they can go and do something else, and that something else is school. And so this is a great gift, in a sense, of the Industrial Revolution, that you get to be here and listen to me. Okay, so what is the role of school? That is a great question. And so I just put some question marks here because why would states provide an education for its citizens? One question is that they want to produce good citizens, that if school can make you better at being a citizen, then it's worth it to the state to invest in you. And so part of that is just making sure you have basic skills that you can read and write. But part of that is making you feel that, America is an awesome place, and that you're ready to participate in public discourse, ready to participate in voting, stuff like that. Okay? But there is this question about immigrants at this time period. We'll see in a later slide. America is getting tons and tons of new people coming to it. And so part of this role of making good citizens is also trying to make sort of your standard English-speaking American out of it. And we see this happen in immigrant schools that are primarily immigrants, where maybe their culture or their language is sort of not accepted, and it was about trying to assimilate them or bring them into the current American culture. And we see the same thing happen in schools on the Native American reservations, right, where you're not supposed to speak your native language and stuff, because it's about Americanizing you as well. Okay, so let's take a look at slavery. Slavery was the big issue that the founders didn't deal with, right? We got the Constitution. It created this government that we generally think of as pretty awesome and pretty effective and still working. But they kind of just kicked the can down the road on the slavery issue, right? And slavery, they kind of thought maybe it'll just go away. But like we saw on the cotton slide, it didn't go away. In fact, it became even more important to have laborers to work those fields, because the machines were so efficient at cleaning the cotton, and the demand, now that there was machines that could quickly weave that fabric, the demand was high, and so there was more demand than ever for slaves. Okay, but we see that slavery looks different in a lot of different places. So a slave in the city is going to be different from a slave in the country in terms of their experience and how they're treated. A slave, let's say a plantation house slave that works in the house for the family, maybe helps raise the children, does the cooking, is going to be very different from a slave that's picking cotton all day. And so slavery looks different, and there is a ton of conflict about what do we do about slavery, what I just put here as what is the right path to do about slavery. So you had some people, which were the abolitionists, right? And they wanted to abolish slavery, make it illegal to own slaves. And they themselves, though, were conflicted here. I put here emancipationists as well as abolitionists, because there's a lot of conflict. Some people said, we just need to outlaw slavery right now and get rid of it. Free all the slaves, let no one else be a slave, and put an end to this evil. Other people had different approaches, like perhaps we'll make it so that anyone that's born now is free, but all the people that are currently slaves will still slaves, and then they'll just slowly over time, it'll fizzle out as they die. Other people wanted to have the government pay slave owners for their slaves, right? slave owners were used to buying and selling slaves for a cost, so the government would just pay that cost to the slave owners to free the slaves. And so other people had all sorts of conflicts over how do we solve the slavery problem, right? And this is primarily conflicts among the people that are trying to get rid of slavery, right? They're still not sure how to do it. Could slaves try to work their freedom off or earn their freedom or what? And then that's obviously just one part of the population. And another part of the population is trying to keep slavery because their whole way of life is based off of having slave labor. Okay? And then there was this question of, even among the abolitionists, what do we do if we do get what we want, if we are able to abolish slavery? Some people, I'm just going to put all of these up here, okay, wanted to get rid of slavery, but they still viewed blacks as inferior. And so there was a few different solutions that people had. One was that they thought, okay, let's send all of the freed slaves to Africa, right? We don't actually want blacks mingling with whites. And so their solution was, we'll send all the blacks to Africa or to South America. And then they can kind of just go and start their own life, and we can have America back to ourselves. There was people that were trying to get rid of slavery, but they were kind of doing it like we're like a father figure or a big brother figure, like we're kind of better than you, so we'll just kind of put our arm around you and try to take care of you like you're a child. And they kind of had that view of the black slaves, which I suppose is better than being pro-slavery, but still not good. And then there was some people that were so upset with slavery that they were like, we don't need to try to get the government to make slavery illegal like the abolitionists. We need to start a revolt and end this horrible thing now. And so we're going to look later at John Brown, who did try to start a revolt. Okay, at this time, we see women's rights is also something that's being fought for in addition to slave rights. Remember, women at this time could not vote. They could not participate in juries, etc. And we see that there's going to be a push for women to be able to do those things, but it's going to take not the 1800s for it to get done. It's not till the 1900s that we're going to see that right to vote. Okay? There's also a push for temperance, which we talked about briefly when we talked about the amendments, that a lot of people were seeing that the bars and the alcohol culture were causing a lot of domestic abuse. And so there's a big push for women that were trying to get alcohol banned because they felt like it was hurting them and it was hurting their children, and there was a lot of domestic abuse. And this is one of the reasons that women actually started to really get involved in politics, was because they were trying to get temperance passed. And it also took until the 1900s. But the push starts in the 1800s. We see things like the Seneca Falls Convention, where a bunch of women's rights leaders get together, declare that woman is equal to man, and push for things. And there's a lot of famous women's rights leaders, but just one interesting one was Sojourner Truth, because she was black as well as a woman, and so she was just like on the forefront of everything, pushing for equal rights for everyone. She also has a nice Michigan connection. Okay, so that's sort of all the things that are going on in America. It's changing. The Industrial Revolution is changing America. There's a bunch of new movements, religious, political, equal rights, anti-slavery. But what we see is that America is not changing at the same place. Region by region, or what I put here is regionalism, it's changing differently. So in the North, we see that most states are outlawing slavery. Okay, we see that there is a bunch of immigrants coming to America, but most of the immigrants that are coming to America are coming to the North. And it is a lot. Let me just show you the statistics. So it's a lot of Irish people and a lot of German people that are coming during this time. So 12% of the U.S. population in 1854 had immigrated to America in the last 10 years, right? So, um, right, this large section of the American population was brand new, right? Brand new in the last 10 years. And Irish and Germans, while nowadays we kind of look at those of Irish and German ancestry as like, oh yeah, you're just like a classic American immigrant. Um, at the time, they were kind of looked down upon, right? Most of the white Americans were British, which meant that they were uh, Anglo-Saxon, that they were Protestants, members of the Church of England, and so a bunch of Irish people, which are Roman Catholics and already kind of looked down upon by England, um, are not going to be favored, and same with a lot of the Germans, right? Germans were a mixture of Lutherans and Catholics, but they also were not English speakers. And so there's a lot of discrimination against these groups when they first came. And in the north, farmers were primarily growing food to feed themselves and to sell at market. And so you have slavery outlawed, you've got a lot of new immigrants, and then you've got factories, and then farmers that are farming, they're just making food for themselves, and they don't need necessarily extra laborers. And the north is where a lot of those people that aren't working on farms go to work in factories. So, for example, Lowell, Massachusetts becomes the hub of textile plants that are making fabrics. And it was actually one of the first places where a young woman could leave her home and not be married and go and live on her own somewhere else and go work in these factories in Lowell, Massachusetts. And so, and culturally, it became okay for a woman to not be living with her parents or her husband when she was living here in Lowell working in these factories. Okay, now the South, though, is different. It is relying so much on that cotton that there's a phrase, King Cotton, because it really dominated so much of life in the South. Not everything, but so much of life. And that cotton is being sold to places like Lowell, Massachusetts, that can then make it into cloth. And so cotton plantations are very labor intensive. You need lots of workers. And so even the whole economy of the South is built around cotton and built around laborers. And so, like I mentioned earlier in a couple places, what we see is actually that the Industrial Revolution doesn't mean you need less slaves, it actually means you need more. And so there's demand for slaves that can work the fields to get the cotton to sell to places like the industries of the north, which are then going to use it to make factory or use factories to make cloth, or it's being shipped to England to work in the factories there that are using it to make cloth. So these differences are going to continue to grow these two parts of the country further and further apart, and that ultimately is going to lead to the Great Divide that is the Civil War, which is what we will be talking about soon.